The student got off the bus and disappeared without a trace, and the next day her body was found in a field. The police spent 39 years searching for the culprit, and only in 2019 did modern technology allow them to discover the truth. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Helen Pruschinski. Helen Pruschinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which was located near New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up in love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father received a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton, near Boston. There she enrolled in the local school, where she developed a passion for singing and sports. At the same time, Helen decided that she wanted to tie her future life with journalism. After high school, she enrolled at Wheaton College, 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough to visit her family regularly. In addition, the institution offered a truly quality education in journalism. Helen quickly adapted to student life, doing well in school and taking an active part in college life. Eventually, she had an opportunity she was looking forward to. She was to go to an internship at a radio news station located in Denver. Despite the fact that the city was more than 3,000 miles away from her college, Helen was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. With her also went a classmate who studied journalism. In January 1980, Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before if she planned to be somewhere late. The woman waited a few hours, but at 11:30, she decided to go to the police after all. Investigators had already begun a search immediately, fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her. In the morning, a woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point, they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped the car, walked closer, and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. Police were able to find a witness who saw Helen get off the bus at about 5:30. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared to belong to the killer. Except that in those years, it could not help the investigation because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development, but the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information, using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man. She provided the police with only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step. With the consent of the witness, they invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time, the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. 6 months later, Helen was posthumously awarded her college diploma as a mark of remembrance. In addition, school officials established an alumni award named in her honor. This award was given for the active participation in college life that had been inherent in Helen throughout her studies. The investigation was not reopened until 1998, 18 years after the murder. By then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts. 15 more years passed, and in 2013, the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant that the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends, with whom she was in the choir, took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time the detectives had much more to go on. By this point, forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts had about 3,000 matches to examine, including even the most distant relatives of the alleged killer. Then they had to sift out those who didn't fit the age or who couldn't commit the crime for other reasons. Ultimately, the experts determined that the person with the DNA was very likely the son of a woman named June Estes, who was no longer alive at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old at the time of the murder, so they were ruled out right away. The search for the other 2 sons dragged on, and experts began to explore other options. Another year passed before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie entered her DNA sample into a public database, which was the primary tool for finding criminals. Experts at Parabon immediately saw that Jessie was a fairly close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. In a more detailed DNA examination, the experts determined that Jessie's 3rd cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally identify the suspect, and luckily, Jessie was into podcasts about various crimes like Helen's murder. It was for this reason that she put her information into the open database. After all, genetic genealogy can be used to find a person through even the most distant relatives, and Jessie knew she could help solve a case with her decision. However, she could not have imagined that this would happen immediately after uploading her data into the database. The woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jessie on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Experts, detectives, and Jessie's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The cops immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. As a result, 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect, Curtis White, who also used the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man also had a rich criminal history under his belt. When he was 18 years old, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before fleeing. He was quickly caught and imprisoned for 30 years, except he was released after 4 years. He was released early because he was defended by an employee of a Christian institution for troubled teens, where Curtis had been before his majority for stealing a car. This man said he would be willing to house the offender in his home and find him a job. It's hard to imagine how you can bring a convicted felon into your home with your wife and 5 children, but this man asked the court to release Curtis on those terms. Upon his release, Curtis moved in and took a job as a gardener. At the time of Helen's murder, he was living in that area. He later moved to Florida, where the detectives went in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time, working as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. They monitored the man for about a week in an attempt to secretly obtain a sample of his DNA. First, they removed a milk carton from his trash can and sent it to the lab. Experts found someone's DNA on it, but there was too little to analyze. On November 30th, detectives followed him to a bar where the suspect drank several bottles of beer from the same glass. As soon as he left, that glass was seized and shipped to a lab in Colorado. It took almost a month to transport and examine, but eventually, the detectives had the long-awaited result in their hands. The sample from the victim's body matched Curtis's DNA exactly. He was arrested on December 11 and charged with Helen's murder. The man denied any involvement in the case, so the prosecutor was preparing to take the case to court, and the man himself was extradited to Colorado, and here, something unexpected happened. On the way there, he began to gradually confess to what he had done. The detectives who accompanied him listened to all the details of the crime. Curtis said he was driving down the street and noticed a lonely girl getting off the bus. Pulling out a knife, he forced her into his car for the purpose of committing acts of violence. He then drove her out of town, abused her, and killed her. As a result, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Considering that he will be 82 years old by then, the perpetrator may well not live to see that day. Unfortunately, most of Helen's own relatives did not wait for the killer to be punished either. Her parents and older brother had passed away many years before, and only her older sister survived. Nearly 40 years later, the elderly woman received a call from the police station, finally informing her that the case had been solved. There remains one more creepy moment in this whole story. As you may recall, at the time of Helen's murder, there were repeated incidents of abuse of women in Denver, and these crimes had a common MO. Now detectives think Curtis was behind them, but they can no longer prove it. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like to help promote this video.